I think the biggest hurdle is actually just understanding that there's problems. The biggest hurdle is getting people to acknowledge and care about where their seafood's coming from.
Welcome to the GOAT Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Cassinan. At GOAT, we define sustainability through the lens of intentionality, circularity, and community. With this framework, any problem can be solved. The stories that we share, the pioneers that we talk to, show us a different way to build the future we all want to have.
We're at a pivotal moment where nuclear is needed more than ever. Let's once and for all become a circular economy.
Waste is not cost neutral. Like, it always costs your business something. So if you can get rid of that, then that's good for business as well.
There's this dissonance. We talk a really good game about protecting the ocean, but the purchase decisions that we make don't match with our espoused values.
An ideal food system revolves around relationship. Where is my food coming from? Who's growing it? How is it being grown? And why does that matter?
Thanks for being here. Let's dive into the conversation. When it comes to seafood, Monterey Bay Aquarium, and more specifically Seafood Watch, I think there's such an opportunity to educate people on how seafood works. I think we magically think that the fish ends up on the plate or the crab ends up, in our hands to crack, and we're just like, wow, this is great. This tastes delicious. But we don't understand the whole process. We don't understand the conservation. We don't understand the impact. And that's kind of what you do at Seafood Watch, which is incredible. But I wanted to start with a little bit about what brought your passion to seafood, ocean. What's the interest for you?
That's a really interesting start to the interview, and I appreciate the question. Well, I grew up as kind of an outdoorsy kid, and my parents would take me fishing. We'd go up on fishing trips. It'd be the centerpiece of our vacations growing up, or some of them anyway. And that was always a really important part of my childhood. Inspired me to get into conservation. And so from there, I joined the Peace Corps, and I worked in conservation in Africa, and jumped around through the Pacific Islands for a decade with the Park Service and some of their science programs, and jumped over to the International Union for Conservation of Nature in Switzerland. And I was always working in forests and conservation through climate change conservation and things like that, and loved it. It was great. But I wanted to try something else. And that is what sort of reignited my passion for fishing and the seafood world. And that's when I joined Seafood Watch from the Monterey Bay Aquarium.
When it comes to conservation, I think one of the interesting things is I feel like you're so connected with the natural environment. Like, part of conservation is understanding ecosystems and understanding how that works. How has that kind of started to develop over your career? Because I think that conservation now is very much a common just thing that people will say now. They're kind of like, hey, let's conserve the environment. I do conservation work. But what does that mean over the course of your career? What did that involve?
Well, I think it's expanded, and it definitely does evolve. Conservation work comes in many packages and many forms. And I know you run the full gambit with this show and with who you talk to, but it's everything from working on climate change to working on sustainable fisheries to now there's, plastics and what are they doing to us and what are they doing to the environment? There's deep sea mining. There's all of these things are conservation. So conservation is kind of a broad net for all these different kinds of topics. But it is evolving. 20 years ago, we're not talking about the same things we're talking about now. Well, we are. Don't get me wrong. Biology and science doesn't go away. And issues like invasive species and things like that don't go away. But the way we talk about it is evolving, and I would say maturing in a lot of ways. Well, like I mentioned, the plastics. Nobody really talked about plastics in the environment. Even 10 years ago, let alone a couple years ago, really. Climate change is, starting, I suppose, in Rio with that first climate COP. that's when we started really talking about it as a world, because it's a world issue. It's not a U.S. issue or anybody else's issue. It's a global issue. Um, you know, you just see things change, and of course, like I said, invasive species, another issue, is very important on the Pacific Islands, but it's really important everywhere. It's just more acute there. Things like that evolve through time too. You see where how these invasions happened, and then you'll look at how to mitigate them, but then also how to prevent future invasions. So conservation is a huge net, involves so much, but it's so important, and we all need to be thinking about it. So I, for one, am glad that we're talking about conservation a lot.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think it's one of those things that it it's almost like the exciting part, but also not the exciting part, is that it is a moving target, meaning there's something that is always evolving about this problem. I think sometimes if it feels just like, almost a whack-a-mole, it kind of keeps it a little bit exciting, but at the same time, like, it really illuminates how connected our planet is and how really biodynamic it actually is. Like, I love that you mentioned that we are a global planet, it's not just a US problem, because I think that, the ocean, or for example, even fishing halfway around the world, is very different than what we do possibly off the coast of Alaska. And that's what I would love to dive in a little bit with when it comes to seafood, is like, how does the seafood system work? Like, I think a lot of people, go to the grocery store and they're like, I'm going to get halibut. But like, how does it actually end up there? Because I think that's understanding the supply chain of fish, I think, is very disconnected in society.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I would argue the same for lots of our other food systems, and many of our systems in general in different supply chains, textiles as well. But 3 billion people, about 3 billion people, depend on seafood in one form or another. That's a lot of people, and we're talking about 180 million tons of seafood just to feed us, and that's probably a conservative estimate. Um, we get in the U.S. We get over half of our food from aquaculture systems, from fish farming and oyster farming and things like that. It's somewhere around 50-55%, give or take. And so to exclude that from this conversation would be missing a huge aspect of the global seafood. And so we have to talk about aquaculture when you talk about fishing. Two very different things. But getting the shrimp to our plates, getting the salmon to our plates that many of us love and depend on, it has different looks to it. Some of it's wild, some of it's farmed, some of it comes from the other side of the world. In fact, a lot of it does. I'm going to throw out another figure at you. About, so they say between 80 and 90% of our seafood in the United States that we eat is imported.
Why? Like, why wouldn't we? I mean, especially with fish farming, why wouldn't we have that ability to just do it domestically?
We just don't have the capacity for our appetite.
Hmm.
We consume a lot of seafood, and although American fisheries are quite well regulated, particularly on a global scale, um, and American aquaculture is usually pretty sustainable in our view. Um, we don't produce enough, not nearly enough to quench our appetite for seafood.
I guess aquaculture versus, and fish farming versus wild caught. You'll see it just on the label. It's just like farmed wild. Me as like a normal consumer, I might be like, oh, well, wild, that sounds better, right? It's swimming in the ocean and we'll catch it. What's the fundamental difference between, really the quality of the fish across the board? Because I know that some fish is actually better to have farmed and some that's better to have wild. And so where's that line? Because I think the natural inclination for most people is just go with the wild one, or look at the price and go, well, it's a nice dinner, so let's go with the most expensive one.
Right. Well, issues of taste and texture and flavor and preference aside, because I think both aquaculture and wild can make quality product. So we'll put that aspect aside. But wild seafood is not necessarily better, inherently better than aquaculture. They both have aspects about them that can damage the environment. Um, Whether it's fish farming, and we can get into the details of why that might damage the environment, or wild fishing, we can get into the details of why that might uh, damage the environment, and how we look at each of those writ large. Um, uh, Producers of seafood, we look at them differently, we assess them differently, and ultimately we rate them differently. And that's the information that we give to the consumers and to the businesses to try to drive that market change.
Yeah. Well, and I do definitely want to dive into, farmed versus wild and all the different, impacts they can have across the board. But what is what's kind of the purpose of Seafood Watch? Because what I find amazing about Seafood Watch is really like the beginning, like the idea of just putting a few signs on a table at the restaurant at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Like we'll dive in a little bit on that too, but like that was it was out of this consumer push of like, well, I actually do kind of want to know where my seafood comes from. So what has been that story of Seafood Watch, and what's kind of the whole purpose of the organization?
You're right. I see you read some of our materials. I'm happy to hear that. We did. It was 25 years ago. This is our 25th anniversary. The Monterey Bay Aquarium, which is coincidentally celebrating its 40th anniversary this year. But 25 years ago, in 1999, we produced a little like tent card, like you said, and we had an exhibit in the aquarium called Fishing for Solutions. And we just wanted to bring some knowledge around, what's going on, really, where are you getting this fish from, and what are the environmental impacts of that fish. And so we had this exhibit with this education campaign around it, but wasn't intended to be more than that. But the thing is that people really embraced it, and they thought, "Oh my gosh, this is something that I didn't know about." First off, so there was this knowledge gap that we were filling, and secondly, it's something they could do something about. Seafood consumption is something any seafood eater, which is many of us, can do something to help protect the ocean if we make our choices in a way that's consistent with sustainability. And that's really fundamentally how Seafood Watch got started. We saw this knowledge gap, and we filled it with a program. So to get to the second part of your question, um, in a nutshell, we use science. We have a team of analysts to assess the environmental sustainability of seafood products on the U.S. market, and when they use those findings to transform how seafood is fished and farmed. And as a ratings program, we assess how fisheries and aquaculture operations perform against our science-based standards for environmental sustainability. Then we use those ratings to create sustainability recommendations for wild-caught and farmed seafood. Those recommendations are the backbone of our work, and we use them to work directly with businesses to improve their seafood sourcing and with producers to improve their practices.
Hmm. Well, and what I've loved about the platform too is it's simple. Like I know it's not simple in terms of the science and the research and getting the data, but on the consumer end, having just a red, yellow, green, a stoplight idea, I mean, it made it a lot more digestible to really be like, okay, this works, this doesn't work, be aware of this. Where did that kind of was there a discussion of like, okay, how do we present this information? Because there's one thing to have, you collect data and you go, well, this one might be better than this one. You can make here are the 30 best fish ranked in order, and obviously it might change. But where did that idea of coming up with like a more simple system kind of come from?
Well, I can only guess to that and read back through some of our history. I wasn't here 25 years ago
Yeah.
when that came about. But my best guess, and what makes the most sense to me, is that you need to break down sustainability issues and our findings through our ratings and our assessments. you need to break them down into simple bite-sized pieces that people can actually act on. If you give them too many, if at the end of the day your science suggests something that's very ambiguous, people are going to be absolutely clueless on how to act. But if you give them either a binary decision, which I personally really like, buy, don't buy, makes it easy, or a slightly more nuanced stoplight system like we use, that gives people more of an idea of a direct action that they can take in an easy way. So a green rating, of course, means that we find this fishery or aquaculture operation to be environmentally sustainable. A red rating means that we do not find it to be environmentally sustainable. And our recommendation there would be to avoid that fishery or aquaculture system until they can improve their practices, or until a fish stock comes back, or until bycatch is reduced, or whatever the case may be driving that red rating. And then yellow is somewhere in between. Yellow is that sort of, okay, this is a fishery or aquaculture operation that has promise. They're doing some things right. They actually achieve a status where we would say, buy this product, but it's not without our reservations. And there are some issues that need to be addressed in this fishery or operation. And so that's why we use the stoplight system.
Yeah. One, and I think from a consumer standpoint, one of the biggest things that we've noticed on the Goat platform is that ease for the consumer to take action. I mean, I think a lot of topics within sustainability can be not only confusing, but they're also inherently complex. Like everything across the board is very nuanced, from energy to food to water to ocean health to fishing to, I mean, all of it is very, very nuanced. And I think for a lot of consumers, there's just not quite frankly, even if the interest is there, the time's not there to really go figure it out. And I think that, if you take a grocery store type of mindset, you're walking through, you maybe have to get home to the kids, make dinner, you went right after work. You kind of want to grab the product that you're like, okay, cool, got this, and I trust it. And I feel like that trust side is so important right now in sustainability. And I think just from like a bigger standpoint, I mean, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, it's always like, with the backbone of Seafood Watch, it's been a place of research. So like I know a lot of aquariums are always equated with, it's tourism and you can go see this polar bear and here's where it is. But like Monterey Bay Aquarium is so different than that. Like how does that help support Seafood Watch, just the mindset of Monterey Bay Aquarium in general?
Well, Monterey Bay Aquarium's mission is to inspire conservation of the ocean. And that goes way beyond the walls of that edifice. And, to be frank, a lot of aquariums and a lot of zoos are thinking outside their walls. We've just been able to act on that, and we make that a priority. So we have a whole conservation and science division that works on marine plastics, and we work on deep water mining, and we work on climate change. We work on a lot of different. We work on a lot of policy for these matters and other coastal protection and marine protection efforts. And we have the Seafood Watch program, which is expansive. Actually, goes beyond the rating system, which we can talk about in a little bit. Some of our global programs. But to get back to your earlier point about making it easy, that's something that we honestly, we talk about it every day. We want to make this easier. We've had an app that people could download in the past, although that app is no longer supported. So we don't recommend that people use that anymore. There's an alternative you can get on our website, where you can still download something to your phone and search through a recommendation database. But that database has thousands of recommendations in it, and it can be really convoluted and difficult to use. And we've made some progress on making that simpler for folks, but we want to make more. We're working now on a tool, at least the concept of a tool that will make that shopping experience easier. But things that exist now is we have our pocket guides, which of course have been iconic and tied to our program for for 25 years now. And we've distributed, this year we'll have distributed about 65 million of those. So that's not insignificant. I hope those end up I know those end up in people's purses and pockets and wallets and things like that. I hope people use them. We also have digital guides, which are kind of an expansive list. If you go on our website, seafoodwatch.org, it's kind of an expansion of that. We have also on seafoodwatch.org, if you go to the top right corner of seafoodwatch.org, you'll see something called Seafood Guides. That's going to be your most helpful resource as a consumer. Click on that, and it'll take you to all these guides, including our digital pocket guides and what we're calling our species guides. So if you're interested in salmon, we have a whole guide dedicated to salmon. Everything you need to know, well, we think. Same for mussels, same for, we just put one out just last week on flounder and sole. We got maybe 15 or 18 of these right now, and that keeps growing. So those I hope are helpful resources for everybody. But we want to continue to do more. And I can give you a couple tips while you're in the grocery store as that shopper. If you have the card, or if you can get on our website, great. That'll give you the most granular information, and you can make your most informed decisions that way. Here are a couple of other tips. One, go to a grocer or a restaurant that you trust, that sells sustainable seafood, right? So if you go to a Whole Foods, or you go to a PCC market, if you're up in the Washington area, things like that, places like that, that you can trust that their seafood is sustainable. That's the first easy one. The next one that I like to do is have that go-to kind of products. Do your research on 2 or 3 things that you love, and find out what the sustainability sort of aspects are around that seafood. I, for one, love cod. I'm a simple guy, and I love cod, and I know Pacific cod is sustainable. So I know that, when I go get a fish and chips, if it says Pacific cod, I'm good to go. Those are 2 of the big ones. Another one is always ask. It's always put that light pressure on the restaurant or on the grocer. And it doesn't hurt to say, hey, is your seafood sustainable? Or can you tell me about this seafood and why it's sustainable? You put that on, you ask that. Sometimes it's not easy to ask those questions, but when you do that, little by little, that trickles through the system and helps to create that change at that market level. And that's one of our theories of change.
Yeah. And that was actually going to be one of my questions, was, as a consumer, what can you do, at the store or the table at the restaurant, whatever that is. And, that consumer involvement, I mean, to be honest, it's kind of fun. I don't know if that's like the right way to put it, but like I enjoy the process of trying to find, I think when you decide to have fish, you're kind of like, man, I want this to be delicious, but I also want it to be something that I can continue to have. And I think that that's where that conservation almost seed gets planted of like, well, I want to continue to have this. I would like to have crab a lot. And, how can we make sure that this is a sustainable way of doing it? And I think restaurants want to provide a quality product as well, because that also encourages people to come back. And I think it creates almost this circular system of actually a good system. And what I think a lot of people maybe don't realize is the fish that you may be buying, whether it's, salmon or cod or crab, there are 100% different quality of salmon. I was lucky enough to grow up in Santa Cruz, and my grandfather would go salmon fishing. He'd go trolling with a good friend of his, and they would catch a few salmon, and I would have literal swimming that morning salmon. And you can definitely taste a difference between that and other salmon. But more so, I think, in terms of this commercial side, it comes down to, well, how is it fished? And so what does that look like in terms of, I would say let's start with wild rather than farmed, but there are different, I mean, I was going through the site a little bit last night and I was like, I understood a few of the ways people fish, but I had no idea on some of the other methods that people actually used. And what I love is that you guys cover all of it. So what's kind of the best way that people should fish, and what's the most common way that things have been caught?
Okay. There are many different ways to commercially fish, and I should make a point here that we're only talking about commercial fishing methods.
Yes, commercial for sure.
Recreational is something we don't cover. Let's take a step back, and I had a realization, which I should have had many years ago, but just recently, and that was that fishing is the last thing we collectively do as society, where we hunt for our food. We do it together. We've done it forever, but we're hunting a natural resource. And when you do that, there's obviously levels of take and levels of impact you can have on that natural resource before you're going to get to a collapse, or before you're going to have some sort of ripple effect of ecosystem harm. And that's why we do this. That's why we look at wild caught fisheries in the ways we do. And to get to your question about different fishing types and different fishing gears, there are some that pose more risk than others. But there aren't, of any of the major commercial ones, there aren't really any that can't be done correctly and that can't be regulated and thoughtfully employed. And so I don't really want to call out one as being worse than the other. I mean, there are, it's about what gear you're using in what place and what impacts that's having. And the impacts we look at when we do look at gear type, because we definitely look at gear type along with a fishery, you have to. But the impacts we look at when we assess a wild caught fishery, there are 4 items, and the first is the stock status. How are these fisheries? How are these fish doing? What is the fish population? Is it one that can sustain itself and grow or maintain its own population over time at this fishing level? So it's really the stock status. That's a really important one. Second one, equally as important, is bycatch. With the fishing method being employed, are we catching? What else are we catching? Bycatch is often inevitable, but the impacts of that bycatch can be mitigated in lots of different ways. And so, are we catching an endangered species? Are we harming an endangered species? Are we catching another fish whose population is in trouble along with the fish that we want to catch? And what impact is that having on the fishery and on those different kinds of species? So that's 1 and 2. The third one, is management. Are there policies in place to effectively address the stock, effectively address the bycatch? And are those policies enforceable and enforced? How strong are they, and do they exist? We also need data on all of those things. And then the last one is the impacts on the environment. If you're dragging a weighted net on the bottom of the sea floor, is that a muddy, sandy sea floor which has very little biota in it, or systems that could be destroyed, or is it a coral reef? Because that makes a huge difference between those 2 things for that in that example. So we look at those 4 things collectively, and we rate them against our standards, and that's how we come up with our ratings and ultimately our recommendations for a fishery.
How do you measure stock? Because that's one thing I've always been curious about. Like, how do you know how many fish? Like, lake makes sense, but in rivers you can but when you're in the ocean, how can you measure stock?
Yeah, that's all done by estimates and models. We don't actually do the ratings of the stock status. We look at the science that exists, and so we're looking at mostly government stock assessments. And that could be an international government, could be a local government, could be a state government, could be a federal government. It really depends on the fishery we're talking about. But they do that through the research and estimations through their
Yeah, and I would imagine probably a little bit from, what's been the catch like for that year. Is it
yeah,
declining? Is it going up? Stuff like that.
yeah. There are a lot of
Um,
factors that go into that.
yeah, absolutely. Well, and what does it look like for fisheries? Because I think part of the back and forth that I think what happens in a lot of this is, okay, well, we could go to being a more sustainable fishery, but man, I got to make a living and I have to catch this many fish in order to, keep my business afloat. But I think there's kind of a solution where everybody wins in that scenario. So, like, what does that look like for the people who are kind of a little bit more concerned about, like, well, I've been doing it this way and it's been working, so why should I shift?
Yeah, that's a delicate balance. In many fisheries, it's not an uncommon issue. Um, it comes down to using the science and understanding the science of how these methods and the take and the quotas and things like that affect the fishery, the population, and then bycatch and habitat and all these other things that I mentioned. You in an effective system, those fisheries are regulated by whatever the authority is over those waters. And you hope that they use the best science available to make their decisions. And that's really the best we have as far as regulations concerned. And of course, this is not to take anything away from the individual fishing operation, because they want to see that continue as well. And so they're also vested and interested in sustainability, if you will. The way we work with it, of course, is applying the market pressure. We use our analysts to look at that fishery, assess what the policies in place are, and what the impacts are, and then provide that information to businesses and consumers.
Fish farming is a topic that I would love to get a little bit more into, because I think that is also something that's kind of misunderstood about what fish farming is. I I filmed a project probably about 6 or 7 years ago where we went to Mexico, and we filmed a fishery that was doing tilapia farming in a lake, and they were considered one of the most sustainable ones, and it wasn't what I expected it to be. Let's just say that, like, meaning it was actually pretty incredible, but I had no understanding of what fish farming actually looked like. I just saw farmed wild. What is How does that work? How does that whole system work?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up tilapia farming in Mexico. Generally, they get fairly good ratings as because we look at ratings for both fisheries and aquaculture. We look at ratings on a fishery and a geographic scale, and so we'll look at Mexico tilapia farming, for example, and then we'll assess that industry, the good parts, the rougher parts, and we'll make an assessment at the end. In Mexico, Mexican tilapia has actually done quite well against our standards. But fish farming in general, like I said, over half of our seafood comes from farms. Most of our shrimp does. Honestly, most of our salmon does. Um, Almost all of the vast majority of our bivalves do. It's part of life, and it's if we want to continue to eat seafood, we need to embrace, as a society. An individual, of course, can have their own decisions and thoughts on these different things, and they may or may not like fish farming, but as a society, we need them. We look at, when we assess a fish farm or aquaculture operation, and again, salmon, there's lots of different kinds. There are marine net pens out in the ocean where you'd raise salmon. There are also freshwater net pens. Maybe you saw some of those with tilapia. There are raceways, which are it's exactly what it sounds like, sort of an aquatic race course, if you will. There are ponds. There are different kinds of ponds. There's really intensive ponds that use a lot of electricity, and they'll use a lot of feed, and they might even use a lot of chemicals to raise shrimp, for example. There's also extensive ponds, which are more natural. They might be integrated in a mangrove landscape with few inputs. There are ones that tend to be very environmentally sustainable are recirculating aquaculture systems. And so you'll have, usually a land-based closed system. And that, a lot of times they'll have, it depends on whether or not they, you know, filter out their effluent, filter out their waste, or if they don't, and what impacts that has on their surroundings. But there are so many different ways. There are you can drop lines into the water and raise mussels on those lines. You can enhance oyster beds with small oysters and juveniles. There's so many different ways. Aquaculture is huge, and it's growing all the time, actually at a crazy pace. When we look at aquaculture, we look at 10 different aspects. Won't necessarily go into all 10 of those. We don't have all day, but basically we look at the good practices or the poor practices that an aquaculture operation is using. We want to minimize impacts to the environment, limit habitat damage. So are they tearing down mangroves? Are they tearing down forests to create these ponds? What is their disease mitigation? Are diseases rampant? That can be tough when you put 10,000 of the same species in a pond or in a net. Disease can spread very quickly. So how do they control against disease? And is that control having a negative impact on the environment? Is there pollution? Fish have waste. Where is this waste going? How's it being treated? Are there escapes? And are those escapes affecting the surrounding environment, changing the environment? What's the feed content? Is that feed that you're feeding your farmed fish? Is that coming from a place that is that coming from a source of wild fish, for example, that are in trouble? These are all factors we take in. We have 10 different criteria when we assess an aquaculture operation. We put all these together to come to our conclusion.
Wow. Well, and I remember when I was at the tilapia farm, one of the challenges that they were running into was a little bit of the disease side for sure, but they had this huge lake, and they did the big net around kind of the middle of the lake, and they would move them from, you're this age, and then move them to a bigger net. And one of the challenges that they were running into is actually the lake level was dropping at an alarming rate. And for them, when we first got there, the head of the fishery, he goes, yeah, we used to have our dock up that hill. And now it's all the way down here. And it also has compressed the amount of water that it allows for the waste to really circulate and them to kind of maintain, the ecosystem. How has climate change affected a lot of that? Because I think that does present kind of a challenge, not just on the farming side, but even the wild side. I mean, you're finding microplastics inside fish.
Yeah, huge. It's a huge impact. Climate change isn't leaving anything untouched. And for that kind of situation, actually, if you have a water system like that isn't being fed from somewhere with ample supplies, then you are going to lose your water level. And then what's that going to change to the health of the fish, basically, and the health of the environment? Because you have maybe the same amount of fish in less water, you're going to have a more concentrated level of effluent or chemical or whatever you might have in that water. Another climate change impact on aquaculture is, for example, if you look at the majority of our shrimp is imported, and a lot of that shrimp comes from India, comes from Indonesia, comes from Vietnam, places like that. Some of the practices in some of those places, particularly Indonesia, India, is they'll have low-lying shrimp farms near the ocean. or near a freshwater system like a river that feeds directly to the ocean. And when a storm swell comes through and they have a big flood, of course, it can just go over top of these shrimp farms. And not only is that devastating for the farmer themselves, but it can also release all of these chemicals, all of these most likely non-native shrimp into the local environment, um, and wreak havoc. And as these storms become more and more frequent and the sea level rises, it's harder to maintain the correct salinity levels in some of these shrimp ponds. It just goes on and on. There's so many different effects from climate change in aquaculture. And in fisheries, you have a completely different kind of issues. And to me, the most interesting one is looking at fish migration patterns, because as the ocean temperature warms, the whole food chain is shifting in some places, dramatically in some places. It's pretty crazy. And as that happens, the prey moves, the predators move, the fish move that people are trying to catch, but the policies don't necessarily move with them. And so you might have a policy that's very effective in area A, but then all of a sudden half of these fish are in area B, and that policy doesn't exist there. And so we need to be flexible as a global society in how we address some of these climate change issues.
The migration's that's a really good point, because I mean, you're seeing the way that, I mean, a lot of it's obviously tied to the weather systems as well, but the actual flow of the ocean, I think people forget that currents kind of push water around the world, in a very systematic way. And that when temperature starts to change, that system starts to change, and the ability for, marine life to actually survive and reproduce and thrive. And they're having to make kind of decisions in their own ecosystems where they're like, hey, we gotta go farther north. That's just what we gotta do. How do you communicate that in a way that I guess is positive? Like in a way of because I think a lot of the narrative around this is, hey, 1.5 degrees C and also water temperature rising, we're screwed. Like, we need to do something right now. And I think a lot of that is always rooted in like this panic side of things. And, kind of my position more so like GOAT is, for any long lasting change to actually happen, it's got to be rooted in some sort of positivity or somebody wanting to change, because a fear-based change only produces short-term results, in our opinion. So like, how do you communicate that in a way where it's like empowering?
Well, for climate change, I just heard somebody actually talking about this, and I was pretty impressed by what they were saying. I wrote down a couple of things here. It's funny that you mentioned this. I have it right here, actually. They were talking about kind of shifting from that fear factor, and even that hope factor. I've always said that you got to have hope, and you do. I mean, we can't work in this field and not have hope. And so that's not something to deny. But what was recently suggested to me, and I agree with, is to encourage people to have courage, to make the choices that are best for whatever it is that they're interested in. If it's the environment, if it's climate change, have the courage to make those choices and to stand up for what you believe in, and take the responsibility to actually follow through with it. And so I think the same could be applied on a large scale. If we encourage courage and responsibility, of course, through that lens of hope.
Yeah, I think sovereignty over kind of our own decisions it's huge. I mean, I think there's a sense of ownership, I think, over our planet, from the standpoint of, I think that when you come to climate problems and stuff like that, you go, well, I'm working a job, I'm going here, I'm coming home, and I try to do the best I can, but like, I can't do anything about the atmosphere. I'm not a food manufacturer. I'm not a, what can I do at that point? And I think that narrative is starting to shift a little bit to, well, I can do the best that I can in my own sphere. And then if everybody did the best that they can in their sphere, that's actually where that needle starts to move a bit, rather than feeling, oh, we now suddenly have to make this huge shift in our own society and the way that we live. Like if I told somebody across the street, you now got to change the way you live, they're most likely not going to. They're going to go, well, but that person's not, so why would I do it? And I think when we have that sovereignty of like, yeah, there's a little bit of hope, but also a little bit of courage of like, yeah, I am going to shift things. I think that's where things actually change. And when it comes to seafood decisions, where have you kind of seen that change from the Seafood Watch side? Like whether that be the business or the consumer, what's kind of been that impact over those 25 years with Seafood Watch?
One thing that comes to mind is, and we can only claim a small portion of this as a win, but I know we played our part. 25 years ago, very few companies had sustainability commitments. And now it's something like 85% of companies have sustainability commitments in one shape or another. Now, are those commitments, um, pure? And are they making a difference? That's debatable, and you can go company by company for that. But you see this shift. You've seen this societal shift. Um, people are making their voices heard, and this is shifting our markets gradually. But it's something over the last 25 years you can definitely point to and say, look, there's a different ethos, at least on its face, but there's more to it than that. There's more to it than that. There are people behind these things and behind these decisions. And so I think those shifts are very positive, and that is some positive change we've seen. We also work. I mean, we work with businesses that that have committed to sustainability that we trust, and we know that they've committed to sustainability. And actually, these businesses they supply quite a lot of the seafood on the U.S. market. There's always room for growth, and we have a long way to go. But the progress that we've made at this point is solid.
When you mentioned seafood consumption and that, how much of a staple it is in the diet across the planet, I equate this more to, I guess, the poultry and beef market and stuff, but basically with more access to wealth, beef and poultry and those kind of delicacies were kind of considered, oh, well, it's a luxury, but now that we can afford it, we're going to buy more of it, and that led to more of the consumption of that. Is that a similar narrative in fish?
I assume so. Yeah, I would think that's spot on.
Okay, because I was curious on that because I think that you have almost like look at it as almost tiers. You have shrimp and you have tilapia, and then you have salmon, and they're basically differentiated right now by price points. And that's supply and demand related, catch related, fishery location related. But just in thinking about the pressure on the seafood market alone to either innovate, produce more, whatever that is, driven by the consumer, businesses obviously have to adjust, and a lot of that driven by the idea of wealth kind of being more introduced into the market, more people having access. What are kind of the most popular fish on the planet? Like is it location dependent, or is it market dependent, or is it you kind of always have your leaders?
It's market dependent, which it works with whatever the local population is. In the U.S., it's undoubtedly salmon and shrimp, and we do eat a lot of whitefish, cod, and haddock and things like that. In other parts of the world, well, in other parts of the world, there are the one of the largest fisheries in the world, which is I should say fishery farming operations in the world, is the carp industry in China. For example, they eat a lot of carp, and they use a lot of carp in a lot of different ways. In China, it's produced at very high volumes, and so it is dependent on where you are and what the local tastes are. In the U.S. is definitely shrimp and salmon.
Hmm. Well, and what about some of the projects that you guys are working on? So, I mean, doing a little bit of research, I mean, part of what you guys do is not just the data side, it's not just the education side, it's actually the working with the fishery side. Um, I mean, I know you're working on multiple ones, shrimp, but the the project in Chile I found to be like a little bit fascinating because I also didn't know that salmon was such a big producer out of Chile.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. I think I heard a phrase recently that we invest in the red, and so I'm not sure how true that is, but we do when we're able to, and increasingly we've been expanding our operations to look at to work with some countries in some areas where where we get the most bang for our buck as far as trying to improve a system. And one of those cases is Chile. Uh, we get a tremendous amount. A tremendous amount of the salmon on the U.S. market is from Chile. It is like it's over a third comes from that one country, and Chile has a lot going for it. They do have a tendency, and they have a huge aquaculture sector specific to salmon, some trout, but specific to salmon. And they have a tendency they have to deal with a lot of disease down there. And that is an issue. And the way that they address that issue is antibiotics. Antibiotics can lead to issues such as antimicrobial resistance. We're not sure what it can do to the water column of the local habitats. We are researching that right now to see what some of those impacts might be long term. What we do know is the amount of antibiotics used in Chile as a whole. Now there are better operations and poorer operations as far as that's concerned, but it's over the limit of what we consider sustainable. And so we are working with a group, a large group that actually includes most companies working in salmon in Chile. And we're working with them very closely to try to reduce the amount of antibiotics that they use to produce their product. And so that we have a few people on the ground down there working very closely with industry on some initiatives to reduce the amount of antibiotics that they use in their fisheries, and thereby, hopefully, our goal is to improve Chile's production writ large for salmon, particularly in the aspect of antibiotics. There's a few other issues as well to work through, but antibiotics is the big one. Once we do that, maybe we can get Chilean salmon up to a yellow from a red. Maybe we can even do better than that. And then when we import that salmon to feed our hungry people in this country, we can be a little bit more confident about the environmental sustainability of that product. And so that's what we do in Chile.
What is what's the biggest hurdle when it comes to environmental sustainability of fishing? Is it, and this could be farmed and or ocean. Is it plastics? Is it antibiotics? Is it temperature? Like, I know it's kind of a combination of all, but what would be the kind of the biggest ones where it really needs a shift?
I think the biggest hurdle is actually just understanding that there's problems. The biggest hurdle is getting people to acknowledge and care about where their seafood's coming from and what impact their seafood's having on the environment and how to minimize those impacts. That to me is the biggest hurdle. I don't think I could point to one thing like antibiotics or bycatch. Um, to me, that is the biggest hurdle. Is just knowledge.
Yeah. What is it for you? Why is it so important to you? Because I think I don't know, part of the reason why people do what they do and is because they really care about it. What's the thing for you that makes it matter?
Having worked in conservation pretty much my whole life, I've seen it from lots of different angles. And there are so many things that we as a society are working toward improving so that we can continue to live on this beautiful planet. And sometimes it just makes sense to pick a lane. And for me, I thought I could have the most impact in something that I feel strongly about, which is sustainable seafood. That's why I got involved.
I often tell people like, hey, if you want a reminder of, planet or, the importance of actually protecting it, go spend some time out in it and see how much fun you actually have. Go on a hike in the forest, hop in the water, hike up a little mountain or a hill and just appreciate the view of something like that. I think that immersion is a huge part of understanding the why behind things. And I don't know if this is the case if people need to all go fishing just once, like go get their fishing license and fish once recreationally to kind of realize how actually difficult it is to get a fish on the plate. Maybe that shifts things. What do you think that, consumers, what's the click for them to kind of go, oh, okay, this easily makes sense? Because I think I would imagine, one of the big challenges of conservation is getting people on board with it. Well, why should I care? Why would it affect me? How does it help me? And I know part of that is a little bit of a me kind of thing, but at the end of the day, what's the thing that you think will help people click it into place?
Well, I think you're along the right track there. To me, it's just to see yourself as part of the system. It's just that self realization. So I'm a consumer, and I eat, I don't know, 10 pounds of shrimp a year. Where does that shrimp come from? How is it being farmed? How is it being managed? Maybe I should learn something about that, or at least, if that's an issue, pick something else to eat. So it's really, no matter what conservation issue you're talking about, I think it's finding yourself in that and seeing how it relates to you in your daily life.
Mm. What's your favorite part about what you do? Because that, I think that's also part of it is like, what's the joy in it? Is it just the communication of the consumer? Is it the business side? Is it seeing the A to B, seeing the world as one, big ecosystem? What's your favorite part?
Okay, my favorite part, obviously change, obviously is what I'm inspired to help create and understanding and knowledge. But I think my favorite part, I'm gonna go back to my days working with the National Park Service in the Pacific Islands, and sometimes I would go out to work in county fairs, the Maui County Fair or whatever it might be, the Hawaii County Fair. I'd set up a booth, I'd put on my ranger hat, and I'd talk to kids coming by about the different species that they might see out in the stream. And like we'd have a little competition. And during that competition, I'd see the lights go on. But even better was their parents standing right next to them. When they heard that their kid was understanding, they also got the knowledge and their lights went on too. And so it's just those little interactions where they're excited after you talk with them and they want to go they're excited to learn more and they want to go make a difference. That's the most rewarding part of any conservation work.
Oh, that's so cool. I mean, and I know we talked a little bit before we started recording, and that was, I mean, for me, I had a love for the ocean because I was lucky enough to go to the Monterey Bay Aquarium when I was a kid. And I remember when you can touch a starfish and see the things, you go, wow. And you just see, I mean, for me, it was a light bulb moment. It was like, this is incredible. And I think that like when it comes to the coming generations, that light bulb is so important. I do have a feeling though that the coming generation, whether that be Gen Z, Gen AA, the one after that, I feel like there's this inherent knowledge around the need for conservation or the need to have a minimal impact. Are you guys finding that just from doing this long enough seeing cycles of, consumers and or businesses? Do you guys see a shift happening?
That's an interesting question. I personally see a shift happening with the openness to ideas and the compassion that is more prevalent in the younger generations right now. I do see that there's seems to be more understanding and more of a desire to do good in a different way. And I'm not saying that older generations don't have that as well. I think it just expresses differently.
When you start to look at what's the future of Seafood Watch, I know you mentioned, kind of more tools and more engagement. What's kind of the hope for the future of Seafood Watch? You guys are at a huge, milestone, 25 years. Not only congrats on that, but also I would imagine there's a lot of, well, what does the next 25 hold?
Well, continue moving the needle. I to to assume that we'll get to 100% sustainable seafood one day is a dream. Whether or not that's achievable, we'll find out in several generations. But for the time being, we just have to continue fighting the fight, continue working toward educating people to inspire the conservation of the oceans, and bring in more businesses, make more change, get folks not just in the U.S. but in the producing nations for the U.S. market. At least that's where our footprint is, to help them understand the importance of what they're doing on the ground and how that could be improved for their own livelihoods and their own long term, um, uh, you know, sustainable livelihoods. That would be the goal, is just to continue and build upon what we already have.
Mm-hmm. When I always try and communicate to people that a lot of this sustainability thing, we were talking about this a lot last year on the platform, was this idea of true 100% net sustainability is not possible. And we were kind of controversial in saying that, but we were rooted in the idea that like there is a cost to everything, but it's about achieving the best balance you possibly can. And it's not about striving for perfection, but rather the massive progress that you can achieve. And if everybody focuses more on progress than perfection, we're actually going to get somewhere, rather than, well, it's not perfect and why worth doing it. And I think that one of the things that we really try and communicate is there's like this patient urgency that we have to have of, the bigger the ship or the bigger the industry, the longer it takes to really shift it. And so to expect it to shift overnight, it doesn't make sense. And so being realistic about the timeline of what we can do, and maybe be a little bit ambitious of that. I'm a huge believer in the 80-20 rule. So it's like, if you can push it just a little bit farther, could you get farther down the road? And I think that if we do that and we're patient about it, but urgent about the actions that we take, I think that's actually can create some impact.
Yeah, I agree. I really think that's a healthy way of looking at it.
Yeah. Well, and I think from a seafood perspective, I would imagine it would continue that. There's been a lot of discussion that, whether that be the beef industry, poultry industry, pork industry, whatever that is, there seems to be a more of a shift towards seafood. Like even though there's already a massive consumption of seafood, there seems to be that seafood is almost that protein that we can sustain as a society. Is that the shift that you guys are seeing as well? That there's, despite it already being a huge part, is it increasing even more?
Yes, fishing and seafood consumption is definitely increasing across the world and in the U.S. Um, Aquaculture is really filling the gaps because there are a finite amount of natural resources that we can, like I mentioned before, hunt the fishing. So aquaculture really needs to fill those gaps, and it is growing by leaps and bounds. And so it's really important, as it grows, particularly in areas that we can control directly, like in the U.S. It's important that we continue to be thoughtful about how we develop it, and that's something we've been very good at as a society. in this country and our seafood systems, and I hope we can continue to build it in a thoughtful and scientifically sound way.
Mm-hmm. For the ocean health side of things, what's it, what's the mission on that? Because I think one of the big challenges with ocean is you have acidification, you have coral, you have temperature, you have salinity, you have so many variables going into just ocean health, regardless of the fish itself. Where do you see the biggest problem with ocean?
Oh, I think you mentioned many of them. I'm not sure that I could call out the biggest problem or that I would even be an authority to identify the biggest problem.
What's it to you, at least? Because I think that part of this is, what is it, going back to like what the individual really, cares about, what they can have in their power. What's the most important thing just for you?
Well, to me, it's just general health, and all of those parts play a role. Fishing systems, are they collapsing? Ecosystems, is there what's the state? What's happening with, like you said, acidification? What's happening with marine plastics? What's the Pacific gyre looking like these days? What about ghost gear? What about habitat protection? What about corals? For crying out loud, that is a huge one. And they all interplay. And I don't know that one is more important than the other. Of course, climate change is kind of the umbrella over everything, but there's a lot more to it than that. So I'm not sure that I could identify one. I think it's all one system.
Well, I think and it was interesting you just mentioned ghost nets, because that's something that not a lot of people talk about enough, is that how much of ghost net supply there is, because there is so many, just the industry itself has so much waste to make the product in order to catch the fish and ship the fish and all that kind of stuff. There's so much waste in there, and the ghost net piles are absolutely insane. I mean, specifically more in Southeast Asia, but that does have a profound effect on the community and the waterways and the people. I just always found that like the fishing industry, I don't want to say can improve, not just from the practice standpoint, but maybe from the material standpoint. Is there anything that's, and you may not be the right person on this one, but like, is there a material side of like, can fishing nets be done differently? Because it's generally a plastic driven industry, right? Like the nets.
Yeah, and you also have to think beyond nets. Nets are a big part of ghost fishing, but there's also the lines. There's different floats and buoys and things like that that go along with the fishing setup. It's a lot of material, and a lot of that is plastic and contributes to the microplastics in the ocean. One of the other big factors with the ghost fishing, ghost nets, and other kinds of fishing is bycatch. It can be a serious issue because a lot of these nets and hooks and things like that that are let out in the water, they don't stop fishing. They continue to catch and snare different animals, and that is a long term problem as well. And this has been a problem for probably millennia. It's just getting more acute now that we have more boats on the water. There's more people. There's more people observing these materials, and plastic, has been introduced in the last 75 years or so, and that's sort of changed the equation as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know some of the infrastructure around fishing too. It's even just supporting the fishing vessels themselves. I mean, the amount of diesel that goes into them traveling and everything like that, I think I don't want to add too much complexity, but it's to show that like this is not a simple problem to solve. And I think that the approach that Seafood Watch has been taking is to simplify it as much as possible. But there are so many variables that you guys consider on your end that you really take into account when you're just, for the consumer side, simply giving a green, yellow, or red.
That's true. We take in a lot of factors. Of course we stop we stop short of taking in everything. We really can't account for all of the environmental impacts of a fishery or an aquaculture operation. For example, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to emissions specifically, and carbon footprint, we we don't measure that. That's not part of our assessment process because it can be so difficult to trace. And there's a certain limited capacity to what we can do. We're pretty robust. We have quite a few analysts working months to years on each of these assessments, and we get these all reviewed technically by authorities, by academics. Everything we do is highly reviewed, and we also put them out for public comment to get people we may have missed along the way. But we don't assess climate change, for example, and we actually don't look at plastic pollution in our assessments. We have another part of the aquarium conservation program looks at plastics. So we can't account for everything, but we depend on others to help fill some of those gaps in what they do, and hopefully together we can make a bigger picture.
Yeah, I mean, community effort for sure. And I think, even on the carbon side, we're not discounting the importance of it, of course. But part of what we try and paint the picture at GOAT is that this whole climate thing is not just a carbon problem. And I think that so much of the effort around climate change is literally carbon, 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 carbon accounting, carbon offset, carbon this, carbon that. It's important. But as you guys show at Seafood Watch and how we've shown in a lot of other topics, is like there are so many other factors that play a role in that equation than just the carbon input and the carbon output. And I love that you guys still collaborate on it, but realize that like there's only so much that you can control, that you can measure accurately, that you can actually move the needle on an industry to actually have the intended impact, which is healthier ecosystems for fish and a healthier product for us to consume at the end of the day.
A lot of people equate sustainability with health. Now that doesn't quite fall into our definition of sustainability with what we do, but we acknowledge that people, when they think about seafood, they think about a healthy protein, which you were kind of getting at earlier. This is good for me. We want to eat this. We consume more. They come to us and they ask us, what salmon is best to eat? What seafood should I be eating? And this isn't part of our purview. This isn't something we do. But we wanted to try to address some of those issues. And so for the 25th anniversary of Seafood Watch, we launched a kind of a fun campaign. Every month, we're releasing a sort of a portfolio of products around a single species. For example, that is, I should say, a single species that is both good for you and good for the environment. So fully green rated by us. And we have a group of dietitians that we're working with from Tufts University and from an organization called Food and Planet. And they're looking at all the health aspects of these different species that we're choosing. So we can be fully certain that these are good for you, good for the planet. We call it the Super Green List. And so if you go to our website, seafoodwatch.org/supergreen, and so that's how we're kind of trying to address the health questions that we have.
Oh, I love that, because I also think a lot of this whole seafood thing is enjoying seafood. I think part of it, people are like, oh, I don't like salmon. And it was because that one time that they had salmon that wasn't cooked very well, or it wasn't in, with the ingredients that they really enjoyed, or, obviously that huge concern of like, oh, but the mercury levels, it could, super high. And that kind of, it's always been said that, the mercury in fish, it's like almost they go hand in hand in people's minds that aren't, super acquainted with how to do that. What would be some of your favorite dishes with fish? Like what do you like to make when it's like, okay, I'm going to make some fish? What do you like to make?
Well, I just made a fish sandwich night before last, and I used black cod, which you can or sable fish is what it's also called locally, which you can which I just made delicious sandwich out of. I think it was good anyway. Added some tartar sauce to it. I'll buy wild salmon occasionally. One of my kids really loves that, so I'll throw that on the barbecue. Um, yeah, I'd say there's quite a few different things that I like to eat.
Nice. Yeah, you said you're a cod guy, so
I'm a
makes
cod
sense.
guy. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, because I always found that to be, it's the preparation of the fish that can totally change the whole dish. And I think that's the exciting part about it. I think it's almost, I'm not saying it's uncharted territory for most, but that's part of the exploration and the fun of it is there's so much that you can do with fish. It could be a sandwich, it could be in a pasta, it could be on its own with some lemon juice. Like it really is versatile. Um, and I love that you guys are starting to educate on that side too, through collaboration of like, hey, here's all the cool stuff you can do for health. Because I think that's kind of one of the best parts. One of my final questions, I guess, would be, what's your hope for the future? Whether that is sustainability as a whole, whether that's the fishing industry, whether that is Seafood Watch, Monterey Bay Aquarium, like what's your hope just for the future?
Well, I hope we can get to a place where taking care of our planet is never a controversial issue. It's an imperative that we all can work together and fix together or address together in a way that we can all agree on, because it really is the planet. I mean, we just have this one. This is said over and over again, but we just have this one place, and we need to take care of it, and we've got to figure out how to do that together. It's not going to be one group that gets louder than another group. That doesn't work. We share this place, and we have to take care of it together. And so I think moving beyond controversial environmental issues, looking at the science, taking a step back, and having a genuine conversations with those around us to try to solve some of these issues.
Nice. And where on the entire planet, because you've actually gotten to explore quite a bit of it, where's your favorite place to enjoy nature?
Oh my gosh. What a hard question. One of my favorite places actually in the US. The area, the corridor that encompasses Yellowstone National Park and the Grand Tetons National Park. Ever since I was a child, it blew me away when I went there as a kid. Just the biodiversity there, the large megafauna, the great trout fishing. It's an amazing place, and not to mention the geothermal activity, which is unlike anywhere else that I know of in the world. And I'd have to say that has left the biggest impact on me. I love that place.
Well, Corbett, thank you for just being a part of the GOAT podcast, talking all things seafood, talking Seafood Watch, educating us, but also most importantly, like just thank you for doing what you do. I mean, I think the people who do conservation and choose conservation, it's kind of a thankless career in all honesty, because a lot of the work that you do is never seen directly. It's more just ripples out into society. And so I just want to say thank you for doing what you do, because people like you are needed in really moving things forward. Because without conservation, well, there's no conservation.
Well, thanks, Steve. And honestly, it's also folks like you that bring this out to the world that's such an important part of this whole effort. So I appreciate what you do as well.
Thank you so much for listening to the GOAT podcast. You are the reason why we exist and why we show up every single day.
I've spent too many years being against stuff, and I've found now that it's a little bit easier and a little bit more fun to be for something.
How are we going to power the world? How are we going to build the world? How are we going to feed the world?
Company isn't just good or bad, black or white. Usually there's a lot more there, a lot more that they don't know.
It's actually about what you do in your daily life every day can make a huge difference.
Give this episode a share, join our goat community, but most importantly, go spend some time in nature, because you might find it a meaningful reminder of the amazing place that we get to call home. I'm Steve Cassingham, and we'll see you next time.